Hello, Stardate 06302021. I can read numbers tonight. Welcome to Star Trek Discovery Pod, a kind of smart, kind of funny podcast about new and classic Trek. Tonight, I have taken over the bridge and I am your captain for the evening, Mariah Gossett. But with me on view screen, we have
Mike Garcia,
Grant Davis,
Chris Rogers.
Welcome, Chris. We're really excited to have you on the pod for this evening. We'll get into a little bit more about you in just a little bit. But first, introduce what we have going on this evening. We are here to celebrate Pride. Pew, 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 insert sound effects, and talk about all of the fun LGBTQIA plus representation in Star Trek throughout the ages. We are live tonight on YouTube, so we hope you're joining us during the live stream. We did have this episode scheduled a little bit earlier in the month, but, schedule conflicts happen. So we are here tonight to celebrate Pride. And anyway, Pride should be an all-year celebration, so it doesn't quite matter when we do these things. We're going to talk about some of our favorite characters in Trek, plus some episodes, storylines. Super loose hang tonight, just talking about the characters that we've appreciated throughout the Trek franchise, as well as what some of this representation means to us. We'll also dive into some listener comments about Trek Pride, and we have a few listener comments. And Chris from our Patreon is here to join us as well to give us some of his insights into this wonderful community.
Here I am. I'm Chris Rogers. I'm a huge Star Trek nerd, and I happen to be gay. So I'm a little bit qualified, just a little bit qualified, to talk a little bit about Star Trek and what it means and how it meshes with the LGBTQ community. Let's get into it.
It's great to have you.
Yeah.
Chris, we're excited to have you. I guess I'll go ahead and say real quick, if you are tuning in live over on YouTube, you can drop us questions and comments if you want. Just go ahead and type POD in your comments, and we'll be able to see that a little easier and pop it on the screen. If you want to join the live pod with us tonight, just let us know in the chat. If you're a patron, you can send Mike a little DM message as well over on the Patreon Slack. We'll do our best to send you an invite and bring you on for part of the discussion as well. And if you happen to be listening to this late, listening to the audio version of this, which does come out after we do the video, do know that we do this live over on YouTube, and we do it generally Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Today's a little exception as we're doing it on Wednesday. But we would love to have you come join on the live chat because we get to engage with you directly instead of you hearing us after the fact and complaining after the fact about the silly things that I said. You can tell me what silly things I'm saying on the spot as I'm saying them. And I will promptly ignore those messages as well.
You can insult us in real time and we'll ignore you in real time.
Yeah. You can find us and all of the different various iterations of where we are available at StarTrekPod.co.
That is correct. So I thought first we could just go around and talk a little bit about what, I guess, representation within Star Trek means to us individually. I know not everyone identifies within the LGBTQIA community on this podcast, but we appreciate your allyship and your support. But I just wanted to talk about how generally representation on television and in things like Trek, and it's gotten much, much better over the years. Discovery, I think, is what I've always wanted Trek to be as far as representation goes for me personally. But I think it's so important to see different aspects of people and identity and gender expression and sexuality on television and in media in general, because it allows you the opportunity to either see yourself or to recognize that you're like not alone in your queerness. So it's oftentimes you're just like, oh, what is this feeling I'm having that is so deep down in my core that makes me feel things that's happening on the screen? And you're like, oh, perhaps I should ponder this feeling a little bit more. So I've always appreciated that from Star Trek. You know, I've most recently gotten into watching Deep Space Nine, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about Dax and the representation on that show. But also for me too, like one of the main reasons I loved Voyager so much was there's a lot of different representations of gender expression, which I appreciated. You know, from hyper feminine to sort of riding that line between feminine and masculinity. I think it was nice to see that representation on screen and to know that you can have that identity and find ways to express yourself, and none of that is incorrect. And so I always appreciated that about the show in general growing up. And you know, the concept of chosen family, I also think is so strong in Star Trek. Like these ships are like the ultimate example of a chosen family in some way. And so I thought that was just like, you know, it might not be what they set out to do, but that's the way I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
So that's just a little bit about, you know, what I think of when I think about representation and pride in the queer community of Trek. But Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, Star Trek is a show that ultimately its goal is to kind of project our greatest hopes about the future. And it's in doing that, it's a reflection of, you know, our times now. And before Discovery and Picard, it wasn't hard to find subtext or, you know, or like some kind of representation that's like, I see that in myself, even though it's not quite the same thing. I see gender representation. I see expressions of love. Kind of like we could get into Dax later, but like this representation of kind of a gender fluid identity, maybe, but they're all very much kind of by proxy. And now we have these characters on Discovery and Picard where it's conspicuous, you know, it's here, and it's kind of us, the fans, meeting the writers in the space of acknowledging LGBTQ stories as human stories worth telling. And it's not, you know, through subtext. It's not like this big announcement of like, hey, this is a gay story. It's just, it's a human story. And finally we can say, hey, there I am. It may not be, the details may not be quite right. They may not be a perfect alignment of what my experience is or what your experience is, but it's there. And it's kind of just an acknowledgement that, you know, LGBTQ stories are worth projecting as our greatest hopes for the future. And you know, I love it. It's great.
Yeah, it's that nod where you're just like, oh, we do exist in the future, right?
Yeah,
like my community
we're
is
there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a hint or like a little spice here and there. It's there, and you know, its fullest form.
Mm-hmm.
I love hearing this from you, Chris and Mariah. I guess I've been a close friend and ally to the LGBTQ folks I know since I was a kid in junior high, which is also when I started watching Star Trek. And I guess from that ally perspective, I've been able to certainly sympathize and relate to the struggles of my queer friends and family members on a certain level, kind of with the personal and cultural struggles that I've been through in my life. But I guess I'm just privileged to say that through the queer folks I grew up with and am close to, I feel like I'm part of the queer community as an ally, like a small part. I certainly would never speak for the community or anything like that, but like I have their backs, right? And I love that now, especially with Discovery, which is what inspired us to start this show. Star Trek is presenting characters and stories that relate the LGBTQ experience to viewers in such a profound way, especially with the relationship between Stamets and Culber, and now their kids, Adira and Gray. I think, and all of the queer characters on Disco are explicitly LGBTQ in Discovery. They're not like queer through metaphor,
Right.
like we had in Star Trek of the past. And like, just to echo what you were saying, Chris, these characters are major parts of the show. And that's how it should be, because in real life, queerness does not exist in a little corner, right? It's everywhere. It's in the world. It's in your town. It's at your job. It's in your neighborhood.
We're
For many, everywhere. For many
It's
people, it's in your home. Yeah. And like Discovery acknowledges that, you know, and with these characters and these storylines, like just being there and existing and doing their jobs on the ship, I think it's from my perspective, it's wonderful representation. And yeah, in the past, there's been some problematic maybe representation, but there's also been, I think, maybe more good than bad in terms of how the fans that I know have appreciated it. And in different ways, I've appreciated the maybe, I guess you could say, coded queer characters on the show and things like that. But we'll get into that in a little bit.
For my part, obviously, anyone who's listened to this podcast long enough knows that my introduction to the show was through Discovery. I don't really have a lot of familiarity with the backlog of what Trek is. So, I came into this experiencing a show that much more easily embraces queer characters. We have Stamets and Colbert in a healthy relationship that isn't a, oh look, this is us having quirky gay characters on the side. It's just accepted that this is part of the crew and part of the family, and it isn't presented as novelty as we've seen in decades of shows in the past. And then going back and kind of checking out some of the progression of shows that I've seen, TNG and Voyager, and I'm trying to remember the names of the other shows that exist in the Trek world. But I see this progression of how the show has made attempts to be more open and integrating of different characters, and it's a necessary product of an exploration mission to embrace cultures that aren't your own, and I'm glad that I entered where I did with Discovery, and I see how easy and effortless and how it is just love that is embraced in this show. And I'm happy with how that continues to be explored with all the newer iterations of Trek that I've been introduced to thus far.
Yeah. It's I thought we'd go in chronological order tonight because it is sort of this like hints, right? It's like the progression of the show, and then we eventually get to, new Trek, where we do get outwardly and proudly queer folks within the show.
Excuse me, Mariah. Are we going in canon timeline order, or are we going in air date order?
Air date order.
Okay, I just want to be clear.
So I thought we'd start with the original series with George Takei and his character of Sulu, which eventually gets confirmed as being queer in the Kelvin timeline of things. But and I know his character was never actually said on screen to be gay, but I read somewhere that George Takei was like, but it's like, I knew that was the character. And so to me, that makes that character canonically queer, because I was like, you're the person who originated the part. He was involved in a lot of discussions with Roddenberry, and eventually, like, I think Roddenberry had a vision for what would have been some of the characters in 90s Trek prior to his passing and what would have been included at that time frame. But unfortunately, that didn't happen under his leadership. But I appreciated that the show's creator was open to having those conversations and not like automatic dismissal. And I think to me that speaks so much to the core of what Trek is, which is that like listening and learning and changing through experiences, right? Like I would hope that's what people take away from it. But I figured we had to just start with George Takei and Sulu, of course.
I love that they confirmed that in the Kelvin movies, and I think Abrams and the writers, I think Kurtzman was one of the writers of those movies, confirmed that it was a tribute to Takei, to confirm canonically Sulu as gay. And I think in the third one they even show him with a partner, and they have a daughter, and very like they show his whole family, which is great. And I think I remember George Takei having some issues with that at first. I'm not sure why, but I think he eventually came around and celebrated it himself. Also, Decay to Kai, I never really know.
Yeah, I'm sure, it's probably hard to see the character that you created and probably had a vision for how that moment would have happened. And then seeing it not be something that you get to portray, I think would be a little difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought a little bit of his issue was that his understanding was it wasn't at the time a gay character, and them retroactively changing it. He's kind of like, well, that's not how I'd played it, but I appreciate the tribute, after the fact, but I didn't get that opportunity when I was playing that character. But I'm not really sure. I just thought that's what I had read.
I'm sure there are a lot of
retconning. Sometimes, because I mean, like, I feel like it was a great move to kind of acknowledge Sulu's queerness and be open. I know there are a lot of people that were kind of like, well, you say it now, but but of course, like back then, they couldn't really express that in the same way, even if Decay himself kind of conceived of the character as being gay. Maybe there wasn't a lot of room to express it, and so I know that there are a lot of people that were just so happy to see that representation or have that confirmed or acknowledged. And then there are also a handful of people that were just like, well, you're just retconning Sulu. And it's like, well, they can do that.
Right.
So, they write it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I thought we should bring up at least a little bit is the fan fiction of the original series and how the relationship between Kirk and Spock, like the fandom just went so wild with it. And to this day, boy, did they. Like, I've seen some incredible illustrations and some fan fiction. Chris and I have a chat going where we send each other TikToks about gay stuff with Star Trek.
Yes, we do.
And there's some very explicit drawings that we found on TikTok. But
are you going to share them tonight?
I don't think I want to get canceled that hard. So if anyone would like to see it, I'm happy to share it with you, but you need to tell me that you want to see it first.
Join the Patreon, join our Slack channel.
Yeah. And then we can talk about it. We can talk about it there. But yeah, I think it's so great. Like when it's like, I mean, fans of all genres and a lot of big franchises do this, right? It's like, oh, if you're going to just queer code things, we're going to take that and run with it. And just like, oh, these two men who do have a very intimate like friendship. And that's totally fine. I just want to say that. I know there's been like a lot of backlash from some actors about how everyone tries to make everyone gay. But I'm just saying, you starve us for so long. We're going to do this until you give us what we want.
Right.
So
can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
I've maybe read about some negative comments from fans about the whole queer coded issue. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that showrunners or writers or shows are trying to bait queer fans, but by not explicitly labeling the characters as queer. I was just, but I know a lot of people embrace that. So is that, how do you guys like walk through that disparity, I guess?
Well, for me personally, like there's okay, so for a lot of especially modern shows, I can't think of any like recent examples that like were big on Twitter, for example. But there are shows where it's like they imply a lot, maybe even in their advertising. And then they don't really deliver that. They don't deliver what they're implying quite heavily. And that's where it's kind of like, I feel like you're trying to take advantage of something here that may not be in good faith. But then there's, on the other hand, you have like characters like, for example, in Star Trek, that, again, implications there, but may or may not be intentional, but that LGBTQ fans lean into maybe out of necessity because it fits into a representation of what that they know, and it, or maybe even fulfills like a fantasy of what this character could be if written that way. And so the difference in my mind is pretty clear. It's like if they're doing this and not in good faith, if the writers are doing this intentionally to kind of sell to a particular community with no intention of like delivering on that kind of, not promise, but delivering on that idea, then that kind of feels a little shady. But at the same time, like, I'm gonna find queer characters whether you want them to be there or not. Like, sorry, that's just how it is.
Yeah. And I think the only time I ever have like, issue with it, similarly to Chris, is like if it's not in good faith to the character, right? It's like, I think especially when it is like queer coding villains specifically, which happens a lot throughout media, is like, oh, the only person you're going to see in this show who even remotely gives you that sense of like of familiarity to you is then going to be the villain. And it's like, if you're going to make them the villain, just make them like out and proud, because we should be all characters. Like,
oh my gosh, put a pin in that for what is it, Dr. Chaotica? The
Bride of Chaotica?
The Voyager, like, Flash Gordon evil character.
The Captain Proton.
We'll come back to that later.
Yes. So it's like, if you're gonna do it with a villain, I need them to be like an out and proud villain, because then I want I want a full origin story. I want when they were wronged, like all of that stuff can be tied, like is probably tied to their identity in some way. But so often it's just like there are traits that tell you this person might be queer or part of the LGBTQ community, and then we're gonna make them a villain. Or just make that like anything that's dehumanizing. I think that also happens a lot. I personally haven't recognized it. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. For like, especially trans characters often get vilified and are not shown in great, like, anyway, it's like side characters if they are a character, and then it always somehow results in them dying.
like looking at like especially procedural shows or like
Law and Order, so many.
Yeah, where it's, if trans representation is there, it's almost always like this prostitute who died. Like, it's almost always that, and it's like, come on, like we could do so much better than that.
Yeah. So it's like, I think the queer coding or queer coding to me can be useful if the show is not able to do what it wants to do, because I do understand, especially older shows. I think at this point you got to just like move forward and tell us a yes or no, right?
Yeah.
In this day and age.
No reason not to, really.
But like with like original series, I think the reason people saw that possibility of this like very intimate relationship between Spock and Kirk is like because they did genuinely love each other. And so it's like, if you see that kind of love between two people, you're going to take it to wherever you need to take it to fulfill either a fantasy or to fulfill like what you wish you could see on screen at that time. So yeah, I love that fan fiction, one, exists, and two,
really
does this. Yeah.
I think it provides multiple purposes too. Like, it provides great examples of different ways to be masculine, or different ways to have friendships among men, where on the surface it's not romantic. It's very much platonic love, and it's very much a caring and uplifting friendship between the two. But on the other hand, like, it's providing this conduit for LGBTQ people to look into this and see something more, something deeper that they may not get in media otherwise. So it's kind of like it serves a dual purpose, and both are valid and both are good,
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if anybody is a fan of the YouTube content creator Steve Shives. He does a lot of Trek videos, and he recently uploaded one. I haven't seen it yet. He does a new video every week, and they're basically essays about Trek and in culture. But the latest one was called something like Spock and Kirk. They're gay, right? And he basically just goes into the history of fan shipping in a positive way. In terms of what I've heard him talk about with the video. I haven't seen the video yet, but I'm definitely going to check it out, and maybe something everybody should check out.
Well,
Yeah.
and fan fiction is like, gosh, it's been such a central part of LGBTQ media forever. I mean, since its inception, like that's kind of the bread and butter of where you would find probably better, not always the best, but better representations or I guess headcanons of what LGBTQ representation could be in the future, or what might have paved the way for what we see now on TV, and even in things like Discovery and Picard. So I mean, like the relationship between fan fiction, especially as a especially directly related to Star Trek. I mean, LGBTQ people flock to this almost like out of necessity. They're yearning for more. It's the gay yearning, and it's there. It's real.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to jump into 90s Trek, which is sort of, I mean, obviously the next thing on the timeline, but also it's such an interesting like combination of shows like DS9 that I think was doing some interesting work into representation, towing the line a little bit. Also, though, one of my favorite TikToks, and I will share this one in the general Patreon, is someone, if you're not on TikTok, people will ask a question and people will like respond with their own videos. So the question was, what is something that was made for gay people, but was actually made for straight people? And what was made for straight people, but is actually made for gay people? And this trans creator popped in and was like, oh, Transparent was like very much supposed to be about like the trans community, but was really made for straight people. Whereas Deep Space Nine is, while it was made for straight people, is so trans in so many storylines. And they end with, I looked up how many trans writers there were on the show, and apparently there were none. I'm just waiting for them to come out. Like
Deep Space Nine, the most accidental, like gayest, most trans show from the 90s. Beautiful.
It was definitely the most progressive Trek of that era, DS9, in a lot of ways, right? But it wasn't always perfect in its sometimes like weird, sometimes bad depiction of LGBTQ themes. But DS9, I remember it being the Trek show in the 90s that explored queerness through that alien allegory, like with Jadzia Dax, who is a Trill who lives as different genders throughout different lifetimes, right? And while the allegory wasn't always perfect, and I'm sure many folks feel the episodes of Dax maybe exploring her sexuality, some people might feel they failed to be as deep as they maybe should have been. Just watching as an ally, I still like to think of Dax as mostly a positive step for representation in Trek. Like, her character allowed Trek to air one of the first same-sex kisses on TV. That episode Rejoined. That's when Dax has a relationship with another woman in that episode. And I remember that one being presented, like that relationship was presented with soul and depth and nuance. It wasn't, it was like a lot more nuance that you would find on mainstream TV at that time.
I love that they were like, oh, this was a previous relationship when Dax was in a different, body. But like the idea that their relationship, even across different like gender representation, like that love is still there and those feelings were still there. But then like ultimately they knew, because of the rules of the Trills, that they couldn't really be together, and which is also just like feels very canonically queer, that like the rules of society tells you can't be together. Like, come on. So and you're just like, damn, okay.
Yeah, Ira Steven Behr, the creator of the show, or the showrunner for most of the show's life, explicitly says that was that was a queer allegory. And like he does acknowledge, like in the DS9 doc, that they should have gone further and deeper with representation in DS9, and he actually takes that on. He said, sometimes I didn't fight for it because I didn't think I would win, but I should have fought. And
Right.
that was back in the 90s. But
Well,
he also, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, like, that specific episode, like, first of all, the Trill themselves are like
Mhm.
intrinsically queer because of the nature of how, you know, how symbiotes work and all that. But that episode specifically, like, I ultimately I think it was great. And then also I have these feelings of like they went through all these um, uh, mechanisms to get to why this was okay. Like, well, it's okay because, you know, Jadzia's past life, Jadzia, like, it was this host and that was this gender, and then, oh my gosh.
Oh no.
We've lost Chris. Come back.
I'll just
There he
hold
is.
it. There we go. So in Jadzia's last life, past life, you know, it's one gender, and then we have Lenora Khan, who is this other gender, but it's okay. Back then it was straight, and so now it makes sense. So I mean, like, there's these like, and I get it because it, you know, it's trying to show audiences like, hey, they're not different.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's like you could have just made them lesbians. Like, you could have just gone for it.
You really could have.
Like, you really could have just done it.
It feels like,
Yeah.
I
But I
mean,
get it, you know.
yeah, and like the Trills to me are like the
I'm gonna
ultimate.
fix this real quick.
Yeah. Trills, I think, are such a wonderful way for the show to have said, like, hey, fans, like, we might not be able to do all the things you want us to do because of like network issues, but here's a way we're going to try to show you some form of representation in both, like, I mean, incredibly so with like the trans experience, but then also with like a bisexual, pansexual experience, in that
Mhm.
these folks didn't really need to think about the gender of who they were falling in love with because they've had all of these different life experiences. And Terry Farrell, who played Jaxia Dax, has said on panels that she always felt Dax was pansexual.
Yeah.
So I think that's nice to hear
Dax
from her.
was always depicted as such a sex positive character.
Mhm.
And she was
Yeah.
also a brilliant scientist, and she was a badass who could like kick Klingon ass, right? And she could also like rock a very feminine vibe too. And seeing this, like me as a teen, seeing this woman character with so much dimension in the 90s, who I felt even at that time kind of quoted as queer and buck stereotypes, for me that was very like compelling and eye-opening to see that. And I don't know, just Jadzia Dax is one of my favorite characters. I was going to say also Ira Stephen Bear in
Yeah.
that DS9 documentary. He talks about how people come up to him, and it's great to hear how you guys felt about that rejoined episode and about Dax, because he talks about how he feels they didn't push it as hard as he wanted to in terms of certain representational aspects. But I have a quote here about that episode. He says, "We did something controversial at the time that still to this day, people come up to me and say thank you. That was the first time I felt like I saw two people just love each other, not because of what their sex was, but just because they really just loved each other." So people tell him that, and I feel like you guys are repeating that, and
Well,
that's just
and
great to
if
hear.
you look at the other characters and how they're reacting in the show, they're not reacting at all to the fact that it's two women loving each other, expressing their love for another. They're reacting to the fact that chill society is saying you can't do this because you're interacting with people from your past lives. And
Mhm.
it is very much a metaphor, of course, but at the same time, it's opening the space to say, like, that's not the issue. What you're seeing, what you may have as a viewer may have a problem with, is not the issue. And we want to provide that representation there. And so in some ways, like, I feel like when I hear him in that clip, and I've seen it so many times, talk about how they could have pushed it further, I feel like maybe they could have done more examples of that in other episodes, but at the same time, like, you don't have to push it further in some ways. Like, you can let it be what it is, because like, in comparison, maybe we look at Discovery, these characters aren't like coming onto the screen, turning to the camera and being like, I'm gay. And it's like, we get it, we know. Like, and they're not making that like the
I mean, the
storyline.
toothbrush scene was basically saying that, but
That was a long
But in
time
such a
coming,
like,
and
just
we
such
got
like plain domestic way, right? That's what was great
Yeah,
about that
yeah.
scene.
With flaws. Great. It's a good representation, and it's flawed in realistic ways, in ways that aren't like I don't know, tropes that are negative against queer people.
yeah.
Since we're talking about Dax real quick, Mariah, I'm going to bring up a few comments here.
Mhm.
Chupi says the great thing about Rejoined is it was a complex story, complex relationship story, not this is about this.
Yeah.
And Laurie Moe says, I love that episode. It was one of the first ones that showed someone like me on television. It came out in 1986. I think it was 96.
Oh no, Lori came out in 86.
Oh, okay, got it. I came out in 1986, so it was cool to see a complex story and not just stereotypes. Thanks, Lori.
Yeah, that's great. And I think too, I saw, that same TikTok person was like about, the Trills are that representation, but then also like you have the shapeshifters who can kind of
Yes.
transform into whomever they want. And they're both heroes and villains. And that's what makes like that coding, I think, to me, feel justified in a way, because you are showing that there's like complexities to all human beings, no matter like gender representation or sexuality. And to this day, I still think the moment where Jadzia is hugging her old Klingon friend is like the best way to show someone how to react when someone tells you
Yes.
they've changed their name or their pronouns or their gender identity or anything. And it's just like, Curzon, my beloved old friend. I'm Jadzia
Yeah.
now. Jadzia, my beloved old friend. And that's like
It's
literally the best.
That's amazing, right?
and gosh, they did that on accident. They didn't
I
even know they were
know.
doing it. Isn't that like I love humans sometimes.
I know that a ton of Star Trek fans claim a ton of queer Star Trek fans claim Kira from DS9. And I'm not going to argue with that at all. She was another woman character who had a lot of depth and complexity on the show, but she was also like very stern, a strong soldier, a terrorist, some might say. And she had this like severe short haircut, but her femininity was like never suppressed. And she just rocked it. She was played by the amazing Nana Visitor. How do you guys feel about Kira?
Kira's wonderful.
I mean, I think, yeah, I love the character. And I also think it's like, again, that kind of that demonstration of like the spectrum of gender, right? Which is nice to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when you talk about like LGBTQ ideas, concepts, part of that is also how you express gender, even if you don't necessarily find yourself to be gay or trans or bi. Like, that's part of the conversation too. Like, there's so much to be said for like making space for cisgender straight men to be able to explore a wide variety of what it is to be a man. And wide variety meaning whatever you want it to be. And so like when you see kind of like we were talking about earlier with Voyager, but specifically Kira as an example of a what probably at the time people might describe her as headstrong, tomboyish, whatever you want to call it. Like that's an example of a strong woman character.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in very much contrast to what we'd see on, for example, even the strong women characters of TNG. Like, this is a very on the front lines kind of personality. And apart from her just being like a bisexual icon, in my opinion, Like, I think her presence on that show was wonderful because not only like did you see that strong personality, but you got to see her grow over time and adapt,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
you know, all those characters got to grow.
Yeah, I
And
thought
this is now about why I love DS9.
I was like, I know, I feel like we should have made Grant watch some DS9 prior to tonight's episode, but
Yeah,
Oh, we didn't mention Garrick from DS9.
Oh God,
oh man.
Completely coded
Yeah.
as queer. Even I picked up. Andrew Robinson, the actor who plays him in the DS9 doc, says from day one, I played him as a gay man who was attracted to Bashir, not in a creepy way, but just in like, here's one beautiful, intelligent man. I'm going to play it that way, and he played it that way throughout the entire run of the series, and to the point that Iris Stephen Bear started writing him coded as queer and wanted to confirm that, but apparently the rumor is that good old Rick Berman, from who ran Trek back in the 90s, didn't allow it. But that's a rumor. Basically, Irish Stephen Bear just says they didn't let me do it.
Mhm.
yeah. Well,
Such a shame, especially now, because I'm just saying, some of my bougiest friends who can spend a lot of money on stuff are my queer folks, so they lost out on some dollars.
okay, but like even now, what is his name? Who plays Bashir?
Andrew
Siddiq?
Siddiq. Yeah.
He and Andrew Robinson have been. He does this program on YouTube where they reenact fan fiction.
Right.
And it did on screen, and they've had other actors come in, but they've basically kind of created this post DS9 actor canon that Bashir and Garrick were in a relationship together, if brief, and they leaned into that. They've had, I think they've had Nama Visitor on it, and she's kind of been interactive with that, and so like the actors are aware of this, like, and they lean into it and they support it. So Garrick, what a wonderful gay character.
Love Garrett. Hey Grant, Marge says you at least have to watch Rejoined from DS9.
Oh, I have
And
I'll make a
the
watch list for
episode
you
where what's the episode where they all go to Risa or Risa?
Oh yeah.
The
Something
one
like
with like Worf and
the one with Vanessa
Sophia?
Williams, Cast the
Uh-huh.
First Stone, or He Who Is
Yes.
Without Sin.
That's
Yeah.
it. Anyway, that's another one that's in my queer canon of DS9.
I have a
Great.
lot in my
Yep.
queue.
We'll make it work.
A lot
Yeah,
of
I'll make a
episodes
little
that you guys
watch list. Just watch it on Netflix and watch it like at 1.5 speed, and you'll get through faster.
That is the best recommendation for Grant in terms of watching old Trek. Yeah, do that.
I love when
Yep.
they all sound like chipmunks. It works for me.
It's great.
I mean, we can talk a little bit about TNG and Voyager. I will say I think there's no outwardly, like, I think of characters until now. We now know that 7 of 9 is into whomever, which to me makes sense because 7 of 9 almost at the beginning seems like an asexual character, and then like has to sort of like learn what human sexuality is, what dating is, and unfortunately the doctor's just like, heterosexuality for you. And like I was like, oh,
Also,
is
date
sad, but
me.
okay. Yeah, which is interesting.
Picard writers really came in and said, women loving women rights. Like, oh, I was so excited when I found out she was coming back, like in the previews, and I was just like, come on, let's get to that episode. I don't have that much time. We get there, and then oh my gosh, at the end, are you kidding me?
You're like,
she's
okay, I
bi,
guess I
maybe
am watching
lesbian.
this. Which
Okay,
I
I'll
mean,
be back for season 2.
yeah, I'll be back for season 2. But also I think it's interesting with 7 of 9 is like, if, thinking about the Borg, which aren't like that we've seen any sort of like have any sort of sexuality to them, like alien species, but they you know, a lot of them were transformed prior, right? So like what was their sexuality prior to being assimilated? But then
Right.
there's also the concept of like their ruler is a queen. And so it's like they are essentially all just serving at the hand of this like femme presenting character, right? Like they call her a queen.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to me.
So, someone in the chat, I don't want to throw us off, but they were mentioning the TNG episode, The Outcast.
Oh yeah.
And
I knew it was
this is
coming.
Yeah.
there we go. And yeah, why don't you guys talk about this? Because I remember watching it and finding it interesting when I was a kid, but then reevaluating it as an adult or trying to reading about it, finding it somewhat problematic, but also like good try. I don't know.
I mean, Kathleen really sums it up with the, oh God, the outcast, they tried, bless their hearts, which
Yeah,
is like,
they really thought they did something there. And,
yeah.
you know, they really thought they were doing something with that.
I have not watched it in a very long time. I only remember my emotional reaction to it, but
yeah,
I can try to find like a.
This is when
I have
believe
watched
Riker
it recently.
Yeah,
Riker
Mhm.
falls in love with a member of a species that is
does not have a gender,
conformed genderless.
Yeah.
But the character that he falls in love with or has a relationship with wants to confirm themselves as feminine. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then at the end, it's a sad ending because she or the character does not.
Yeah.
That right is taken away from them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh man, there are a lot of sins in that episode, in my opinion. But I mean, like, I don't think it. I absolutely do not think it was ever in bad faith, which is why I feel like it's worth watching. You know, even if sometimes I'll rewatch it, sometimes I won't because it's just, you know. But I think they really thought they were doing something there. But then you have things like it's an agender character, or an agender society even.
Mm-hmm.
And so they lean into androgyny.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my God, if we could stop writing androgynous characters that are expressed as being just drab.
Yeah. And it's also,
Like,
I mean, there's like, you know, the conversations right now that I have seen from my friends who, you know, are on various aspects of the gender spectrum. It's like, if you're non-binary, like folks don't owe you androgyny. Like the way that
right.
you outwardly present has nothing to really do with what your like actual what your personal gender is. And
Well, and because I
yeah.
think part of that is like there is still this mental thing of like, well, non-binary is in the middle, right?
Right. When
And
it's like it is
it's
literally
actually
like you can be here or here or over here or over there.
yeah, it's like non-binary literally means like it's not two.
Yeah.
Outside of the two. The two that you're thinking about, not me. So it's just kind of like, okay, well, you have this idea, or like, yeah, we have this idea of non-binary being somewhere in the middle or being androgynous or like and it doesn't have to be any of those things. Like maybe for some people that's what it is, but maybe for some people, many people, it's not at all like that. And it can look like something different. It can look like feminine or masculine or something else entirely that's, you know, self-conceived. But
I mean, to me, my main takeaway from the episode is really that Riker is canonically pansexual. Because that is the alone.
Better. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, he pretty much makes love to every chair he sits in.
My gay agenda is making sure at the end of the day, all characters are gay in some way. like that's my hope and dream. But
one could hope. But
Riker
yeah,
as pansexual is strong.
Yeah, because I'll have to go back and rewatch it to like really be able to put like thoughtful concepts into this. But I could see how like the concept of a society that does not have gender expression would be an interesting, like as a writer would be very interesting to go down that rabbit hole. But at the same time, it's like, oh, well, how sad that then the person who finally is the outlier, right? Like that is the queer character of that society, right? Like they are now the person who is different from the rest of them. And it's so unfortunate that it ends in like tragedy rather than like, oh, let's now explore what it would be like to have multiple like identities in society.
Yeah, it ends in tragedy. Like that is a fascinating concept to look at. But yes, it ends in tragedy, and then also the overarching attitude among the crew towards that is, even if it's not explicitly, it's very much like there in subtext that it's just like we pity you for not having dinner.
Right.
And it's like that's not part of it either. Like that's not part of the answer in my opinion either. So it's just there's a lot of things in the episode that I have feelings about. But
Marge in the chat says the episode is likely about conversion therapy.
Yes, and for that reason, a lot of people don't enjoy watching it.
Yeah.
It may be a valid episode, but yeah.
Yeah, there's no reason to put yourself through trauma you don't need to experience again.
Oh, God, no.
But since we're almost an hour in and we haven't yet talked about the gayest trek of all, we have to start talking about Discovery, if only to also get Grant to be able to talk about something on this episode.
It's cool, guys. I'm enjoying the conversation, even though I'm just kind of lurking here.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like butting in. I'm loving listening to you guys stuff.
But yeah, I mean, I think Discovery is like that kind of future you want to see, right? Where there is like a variety of the community even represented on the show, right? Like we have different gender expressions, we have different sexualities, and then also like we get various kinds of characters, right? These are complicated, real, full-figured characters. We get everything from like the more lighthearted, like comic relief in Jet Reno to these like very deep concepts of identity with Adira and Gray. And I think someone had mentioned in the comments earlier, and I wanted to save it for now, about Jojo. And like, I guess there is controversy around Jojo. I didn't really know that there was one. To me, it makes sense that Jojo would be like a bisexual, pansexual person.
I think
to me, anyway.
Part of the controversy there, right?
Oh, and the comment was from Chupi. Can you talk about the controversy over Jojo? Does it only exist because some people think she's a villain and others that she's a product of her universe and more complex than just quote unquote villain?
There is a history of the mirror universe having like the canonically like villainous bisexual, and I think that's worth pointing to and looking at. I personally love a bisexual villain, but you know, that's my own preference, and I don't think that there shouldn't be criticism against that.
Yeah, it is interesting that is sort of a repeated pattern that folks from the Mirrorverse are somehow canonically more queer. But I think we also just went through all of these other. I feel like Discovery can do it more than any of the other shows could, if that makes sense.
I mean, what I took from it, you know, not being as familiar with how they play up the Mirrorverse, is that Jojo is just a person very confident and in control of who they are sexually, and she is very comfortable with that exploration and embracing of it, and it felt like a powerful representation for me of someone who's pansexual.
Yeah, and it's also and I hope we get to see more folks who are not in the mirror universe also express some identifiers within the kink community, because she is so far the only character that has outwardly expressed you know, that she enjoys some sort of perhaps impact play or pain play in some way, shape, or form. So not that we need to know about everyone's sex lives on a TV show, but you know, let someone leave some handcuffs somewhere,
more
some
Jojo
somewhere, or just more Jojo.
Chupi has an interesting comment. She says, I saw a lot of LGBTQ community saw it as a trope of her queer sexuality because she's a villain, but I don't see her as a villain.
I think that was a lot
I
of the growth of her character, though, right?
Mhm.
Like she
Right.
initially was a
Right, yeah.
villain who was subsequently brought in reluctantly, and
Part of the crew.
they had her evolve who her character was, and I don't recall us seeing those other kind of facets of her until we also, as a viewing audience, were embracing her as more of a complex character than simply a villain, right?
We
Yeah.
don't see queer Jojo until we see mirror Jojo, and I think that should be on some level, like yeah, we can look into that and see, well, why is that? Because like I said before, like we do have a history with Trek taking the mirror characters and making them queer, and conjunction of them being the bad guys. So I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of criticism to be
There's valid criticism.
levied.
Yeah.
Valid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's valid criticism there. So like, I think it's worth looking into that. But at the same time, like, and specifically with Jojo, like, I feel like maybe Prime Jojo was queer in some way, and we just didn't get to that. Maybe it is a valid.
Yeah, she could have been. We didn't spend much time with her at all.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. it'd be
But I
interesting.
do understand the criticism totally. Yeah.
100%. I think, like you said, Chris, I personally love a chaotic bisexual villain, especially when there's equal representation of like the good guys on the other side. But I do think
Right.
it's like a valid criticism of the Trek canon, right?
Well, I just wanted to point out real quick. So far, with Discovery and Picard, we have representations with all the letters of the 5 letters LGBTQ. Like we have gay characters, we have I presume bi character with 7. We don't really get a confirmation there. Trans, non-binary, and they're not doing this in a like. It's not like a front-loaded like, hey, we're doing this to get like check all the boxes. It very much feels like natural characters that you would encounter in the world.
Yeah.
People that you would encounter in the world.
I do have one friend who felt had a little bit of criticism in the disco episode in which Adira and Gray are introduced and we get to know about their relationship because that episode and story was rooted in so much trauma and it was difficult for her to watch. But I'm just wondering how you guys felt about that. I know we talked about it's difficult to watch that old TNG episode sometimes because of the trauma inherent in it.
Well, I feel like in this instance, it's about overcoming trauma. Like it's not. I don't think it's there to like trauma for trauma's sake. It's not like make the person suffer for the sake of making them suffer, for the sake of ending the story some way. So personally, I don't mind it, and I thought it was a beautiful episode. But again, like I completely understand that criticism because everybody is going through their own stuff and they have their own life and their own past with trauma, and they're totally allowed to not want to have to like trudge through that to get to the other side of that. They don't have to deal with that in that way.
Yeah, I think what Chris said really wraps up a lot of my feelings to it as well. As like I did personally enjoy the episode, but I did like that thought creeped into my mind of like, oh, of course, like we have to kill one of our queers in order for them to exist in this universe, which
that was a thing.
which was, I thought we learned that lesson with Culver, but
that is one criticism that I will levy against.
but it is
Right.
like a complicated drama series, and like I think they've tried to really redeem themselves, and to the fact that these are like fully rounded, realized characters. This isn't like an episode of the week where we're going to just like kill our queers each week, like we get to see them evolve and like have real lives. But again, like I think it is a valid criticism. I know that they do so much work behind the scenes to like really embrace the LGBTQIA community with like how they're trying to get more folks, I think, behind, because that's a big thing too in the industry, is not only do you need representation in front of the camera, but also behind the camera, because that is like where you get more accurate storytelling.
It is fascinating to me that they essentially did this twice, because the first time they did it with Colbert, it seemed like, you know, they got called out for it, and it did not seem like they had a natural progression of how they were going to have him die and then reintegrate. They did a little bit of ridiculous, let's have him come back from a mycelial network cocoon or whatever they did, which
He's made of mushrooms now.
that was there's no way that was part of their original plan. They thought, we'll have emotional payoff from the weight of killing this character that will give resonance to Stamets's character's growth. And then so they went, oh, we need to bring him back. That was probably a mistake. At least that's how it seems to play out for me. But at least with the Adira and Grace storyline, it feels much more like the death had the scope of where they wanted to go with that storyline a little bit more baked in, and it was like, we're gonna have Gray die, but Gray will still be around and present for a while until we can reach a natural flow of reintegration.
I certainly don't speak for the whole community in saying this, but like I personally feel like I am okay with the writers making mistakes and how they approach these storylines and plot lines and how it may come off. Like when they first brought on this gay couple characters, I'm like, oh my god, like great. And then Culver dies. I'm like, what? What did you do? And then the same thing with Adira and Gray. I personally am making space for them to mess up here and there, as long as I know it's in good faith. And I do. I feel like I know that on the most basic level, it is in good faith. They're not trying to do this or trying to follow these tropes or anything like that. I think they're stumbling into them maybe very hard, but you know, I do see it as like they're approaching this in good faith. So I will kind of like make space for it, make space for that mistake. If it
is probably good to note that the showrunner behind Disco during when we were introduced to Adira and Gray is Michelle Paradise, who is, like you were saying, Mariah, it's important to have representation behind the camera, and she definitely depicts that. There's a conversation in the chat going on about Detmer. Chippy says, I'm pretty sure Detmer is bi.
I mean,
and I do want to say that the actor who plays Detmer, Emily Coutts, plays a queer character in Clarice.
Yeah, and she is part of the community. I don't know exactly how she identifies, but she is a part of the community in real life. So I'm sure that just might come through on screen. Also, the undercut of the hair is just like the signaling alone.
And like Detwo, come on.
Yes, that is our fan fiction.
I need a supercut of every time they look at each other, like from across the bridge. I need that. I need it in my life.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my
Detmer
God,
and OO.
yes. Together.
We get this comment from Kern. I give them some slack over Culber's death, considering how chaotic things were in season 1 with the revolving showrunners. And I do think there's something.
I give them a lot of slack for a lot of different things for that reason.
Like 4 different showrunners in 4 years. Yeah.
There's quite a difference between what we see tonally going on with season 1 and season 2. And yeah, there's a lot of repair and adjustment, I would say, that goes on in season 2 from what Fuller did with season 1, which I enjoyed season 1 for how dark and heavy things were. But
don't blame Fuller. He was fired before the first episode.
Was he really? I thought he had mapped out a lot of it.
Not really. They took some of his concepts, but it's debatable how much he was, how much of his blueprint they ran with.
Well,
Something real quick I just thought of with the introduction of Adira specifically. I noticed like in the fandom, because there was a lot of press about Adira being non-binary before the show ran, there is a lot of confusion about what pronouns to use at the first few episodes before the character of Adira came out. And there's kind of fans on both sides saying like, no, like Adira's not out yet, use she, her pronouns. And then there are fans that are saying, no, like we know that Adira is non-binary, like use they, them. And so I feel like this is a kind of an example of the show providing people a little space to kind of slip
Oh,
up or like try to navigate how to approach that. And ultimately the lesson being like, take people for their word, you know, like if they say they're this, they're that, follow that.
Yeah.
And if you slip up, that's fine, correct yourself and move on, you know. So I thought it's kind of an interesting like parallel of like, this is providing a real world example of people trying to figure this out, but in a safe way, because Adira is not the actor is a real person, but Adira is a character that's fictional and, you know, like cannot be intrinsically harmed by misgendering. So we can kind
right. I mean, we
space to do that.
certainly ran into that here on
Sure.
how we were trying to navigate, trying to respectfully discuss and properly pronoun the character. And so
Right.
figuring out like as we're discussing with the storyline as it's progressing before we get to that point, we're like, you know, I find that those conversations, when I mess up and I'm informed about it, those are always so much more helpful for me. I realize how I can be better about how I'm articulating myself.
Yeah. And I want to thank everyone who listens to this podcast, especially those who are vocal and into Slack, for when we do make mistakes like that. We're in a space where we can be educated and then we can talk about it and have that discussion and move on, just better, more informed people.
Yeah. And it's so nice to just be like, I don't know. I personally think it's better when someone corrects you to say like, thank you, because you're like, it is so nice that that person then feels comfortable enough to correct you. Right. That means your relationship is strong, rather than being like, oh, I'm sorry, because it's like, there's no blame. It's just like, oh, thank you for informing me of my mistake. And like, we can just move forward with the correct word usage.
Or saying like, I'm sorry. And it's like, you don't want to necessarily have to put that person in the position of saying, no, it's fine. Like, maybe it's not.
Yeah.
I just learned this. I'm pretty sure I'll say sorry about everything.
I mean, it's a natural response, you know. It's
and I'm not going to apologize this time.
Yeah, just be like, thank you. You know, and correct and move on.
Thanks for that tip.
You're welcome.
Hot gay tip.
Hot gay tip. Yeah, I wanted to read. So we asked a couple of our patrons for their thoughts about Pride and Trek. And so this is from Home Chickie. They said, for the Pride Pod, nice alliteration. My partner and I have been together since 1998, and we have an 18-year-old daughter who grew up in gay culture, but now dates cis hetero men, but gathers all the LGBTQ people around her. Home Chickie says, I identify as bi, but not poly, and so many people assume you can't be one without the other. That is very true. Recently, I have changed my label, for lack of a better word, to pansexual, because if I were single, I would date a person based on their personhood rather than their gender, and if they're not cisgender. I use bi and pan interchangeably, just me personally. But Home Chickie continues, however, for the most part, I don't date since I'm married, lol. And then continues to say, I think Ronald Moore was too conservative about LGBTQ issues in the 90s. TOS took on controversial issues in the 60s, but TNG, etc., only danced around LGBTQ issues. Of course, y'all already know the examples, and gave some thoughts about some stuff we had already sort of talked about. But yeah, I'm so glad. Thank you for sharing, Home Chickie. And yeah, Bi panic and bi erasure is very real.
Hey,
Just because I like all genders doesn't mean I date everybody at the same time. Also, there's no shame in that either if that is what you've arranged with your person.
Also,
Thank you.
like, Ronald, was it being conservative about gayness in the 90s, considering all the shows in the 90s were so gay? Like,
Oh,
yeah.
right? I mean, yeah, the representation, we were really digging, like I mean, I watched the L Word for better or for worse, you know, because you're just grabbing at
That'll
straws
do
for
our time.
finding yourselves. Oh, the dark times.
Queer as folk.
And, but Noah's Ark is a sleeper. I really want to revisit Noah's Ark, but
I mean, Frasier was a pretty gay show too.
Carmen has a real quick question. Pod, what are your thoughts on Lower Decks? For me, I feel there was that episode where Boimler has a girlfriend, not girlfriend, and it felt like Mariner was vibing with a girlfriend a lot more. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on Lower Decks, guys?
I mean, we haven't had anyone like come out as of
Yeah.
yet, but I'm like,
No.
I was going to say, I can't remember like a very explicit example of LGBTQ-ness.
I almost feel like Rutherford would be like the big teddy bear bisexual, pansexual person, but that's just me. But I don't know.
Who is the
Yeah, we'll
Bajoran
see.
security officer?
Oh, Jax with a J, not Dax.
Gay rights.
Q, maybe that Q character.
I mean, honestly, though, Q,
and Picard.
Yeah.
Q and Picard.
they're
Yeah.
into each other. They really have a relationship longer than most marriages. So.
Yeah. What, 40
I'm
years?
calling it Picard season 2. We're gonna see it.
I mean, Sir Patrick Stewart's like BFF is Sir Ian McKellen, so maybe it's just like he's like been in his ear, being like, "Hey, I know what
Yeah.
the fans want to see.
Yeah.
I got this for you."
He's like, trust me, they do it with Lord of the Rings all the time. This is
All
what they want.
the time. Well, did y'all have anything else you wanted to talk about? We've gone over our normal time slot here.
I just want to thank Chris for coming on and having this conversation with us.
Thank y'all
You
for
answered the
having me.
call and it was great having you on. I hope we have you back.
Thank you so much for having me. I know this is part of the outro, but I do want to say I am a subscriber to the Patreon, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is $2 an episode. You get to have all this extra content. We have a wonderful Slack channel. We have an amazing community of people, Star Trek fans. We watch Star Trek episodes like almost every night. It's great. Join us, subscribe, pay money to these great people. They deserve it.
Do it. Say it.
Yes. Well, now we can skip that part of the outro. But yeah.
Mariah, I
Chris.
want to thank you for leading this discussion too.
Oh, thanks,
Yeah.
guys. This was really nice. I will always talk about queer things anytime, day or night. I'm ready for it, especially when it comes to entertainment and especially in Trek. So thanks for being open to us having a Pride episode. Thanks, Chris, for joining. It was really nice to be able to talk to you outside of our Slack discussions and TikTok shares and see your face. It was really lovely. But yeah, that's kind of it for us for this evening. We'll be back next Thursday. I'm going to come up with a Voyager Q episode for Grant to watch so that we can continue our Q discussions as well as make Grant watch some Voyager. Win-win for everybody.
Yeah, most people.
I do want to say, I think the Voyager episode that we're talking about with Q, where they have a civil war in the Q continuum, I
Great
think
one.
is a two-parter.
I
So
think so.
Ooh.
you're welcome,
If you
Grant.
watch it on your own, again, 1.5 speed on Netflix.
That's the way to go.
No, we have Death Wish for Choopy.
Well, no,
Oh, we could watch
honestly-
Death Wish.
Honestly, don't watch it at 1.5 speed because you got to get all those like long pauses between between Janeway and Q. Yeah, gotta get the tension.
Mhm.
It's part of it.
Gotta have the tension.
I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be great.
Do one of y'all want to tell folks how they can follow us on the internets?
Yes. You can follow us at StarTrekPod.co. You can go there and you can subscribe to us on all of the platforms that we're on. You can, of course, you guys know the thing. I mean, at this point, you don't need us reminding you to hit subscribe. If you haven't done it yet, you ain't gonna do it. If you haven't hit
Sub
that
to
like
the
button, you
YouTube
ain't gonna do
channel.
it.
We need more subs on the YouTube channel.
But we also are over on Twitter and Instagram. Shout out to James Worm over on Instagram and Karen, who's running our socials on Twitter. They do a fantastic job, and we would love to have you guys support them as well and go give that a follow. And as always, we appreciate you. Thank you for joining us this week.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging. We'll see you next week.
Thank
Live
y'all.
long and prosper. And be gay.
Bye.
Bye.